Hello, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are coming from. My name is Ato Quayson, and I'm a professor of English at Stanford University. And I have the very, very happy position of moderating this magnificent session. Let me start off right away by welcoming you all, and then also by giving just brief introductions to the various directors and thus speakers. First, we have Jennifer DeVere Brody, who is professor in theater and performance studies at Stanford, where she serves as the faculty director of the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. In other words, she's my colleague. Hi, Jennifer. Stephen Pitti is the director of the Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, and a professor of history, American Studies, and Ethnicity, Race, and Migration at Yale University. Hi, Stephen. C. Riley Snorton is the interim faculty director at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and a professor of English and Literature and Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Chicago. Hi. Tricia Rose is Chancellor's Professor of Africana Studies and the Director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America at Brown University. Hi, Tricia. So we open with Jennifer. So Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ato, and colleagues here. It is indeed an honor to be part of this collective and this conference on racial reckoning. I'm speaking to you from the unceded Muwekma Ohlone homelands, an acknowledgement that only begins to reckon with the reparations required to repair the damage of centuries of racial capitalism that calls upon us to exercise, in Teresa Montoya's words, radical vulnerability. In yesterday's panel, colleagues spoke eloquently about the reorganization of knowledge, power, savoir-pouvoir needed to transform the university. As the recent news about the daughter of the African family in Philadelphia's MOVE program, whose bones were used without consent for a lecture involving my alma mater, University of Pennsylvania, and Princeton University, often known as the South's northernmost institution that sits on the land of the Lenni Lenape, and also where I was born, has shown universities have trafficked for many centuries throughout the Americas and in Europe, in the bones of the ancestors. And so we're thinking here about a reckoning of bones from the Americas to Auschwitz to gynecologist Marion Sims. And that's a shout out to Riley Snorton, who's written with such moral clarity about Sims's transgression with the bones of the dead and the living. And so our bodies and our bones have been used without consent in the name of knowledge that benefits what Rod Ferguson yesterday talked about as a professional exercise in benchmarks. Indeed, all the panelists yesterday shared their concern, which we're going to continue talking about today, about how to work more ethically and equitably with the putative objects and subjects that the university hierarchies produce and sustain. And I think that really is our focus on critical race studies and its institutionalization within larger understandings of knowledge. So in my nearly 30 years as a professor, having taught at 7 universities in many different departments, English, African and African American studies, gender and sexuality studies, performance studies. I have often looked to not only other scholars in critical race studies, which was really organized in the 1990s by a group of critical race and legal scholars, but I've also looked to artists whose work intervenes in the restricted covenants of racial order. In preparing these short remarks, I had too many examples of contemporary scholars and artists, Black and Brown, those who work for civil rights, feminist art, ACT UP, AIDS, anti-war protests, against the prison industrial complex, indigenous rights, police violence, farm workers unions, disability rights, Occupy, trans justice, anti-nuclear protests, the demonstrations against the World Trade Organization, the Bay Area's People Kitchen Collective. I could go on and on, but to choose from people who are working to quote the motto of the People's Kitchen Collective here in Oakland, and I do some work with them, to feed the mind, nourish the soul, and fuel a movement. And I'm pointing to them in part, not only because they do amazing work on recreating, for example, the free breakfast in Defemery, Little Bobby Hutton Park, in homage to the Black Panthers, but to try to get at this idea of what kinds of care or caritas that the university, in its Cartesian claims to specific forms of rational thought, too often elides, right? And so I'm thinking a little bit of Charles Mills's work here on the racial contract, on the whole sort of history that organizes Western knowledge, that puts those of us who are working in the margins around critical race studies, right, and want to transform that knowledge in a slightly oppositional or complicated space vis-a-vis traditional forms of understanding what counts as thought. So these academics and artists that I've mentioned begin to try to break down some of those barriers between theory and practice, in Marxist terms of praxis, and intervene in university structures that institutionalize a hierarchical division of labor between scholars and researchers, or artists and practitioners. Something that the center where I work now for comparative studies in race and ethnicity at Stanford has tried to dismantle by asking practitioners, for example, working on ethics, race, and technology to come into the university and teach us and get us to think differently about the knowledge that they produce in their own spaces of work. And similarly, in theater and performance studies, we have tried to tenure artists. So what counts as, the book, or what is tenurable, begins to be undone. And I'm trying to talk here a little bit about the segregation of faculty, not only from students, but of different kinds of valuation of what counts as the imaginative, creative dimension of scholarship. Again, I join a long, long list where Tim Spillers has talked about this in her classic essay on Harold Cruz's The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. How is it that we want to value the different subjects and different ways of knowing, right, in the university that can maybe go against certain Enlightenment legacies that erase and devalue embodied work, which is concomitant with the mind-body split where disabled, working class, female, and racialized others weren't necessarily seen to be thinking human subjects. And this matters because part of the current racial reckoning asks us to change the quote-unquote face of the university. And such a shift for me must not only be quantitative, but also qualitative. We must not just change the color, but also the content of academic culture, redo the syllabi, reorganize academic apartheid, to use Dwight Conkergood's phrase. At Stanford, we did just finally hire 2 artist scholars, young Jean Lee among them, whose play Straight White Men was the first produced by an Asian American woman on Broadway. And like Toni Morrison, we hope she'll be the first tenured creative artist in our program. We can see that also what happens to the extra-diegetic, I'll call it, labor that too many of us scholars of color are asked to do on the behalf of changing the face of the university. I'm talking about all of the uncredited and unpaid, if you will, labor to diversify the university, right? How does that get accounted for in questions of who is valued and what is valued as forms of work under the university rubric? We can see that a whole-scale cultural, economic, and political change is required to begin to achieve racial justice in the university. In my own work, I've spoken about the difficulty of having inherited a segregated academy that makes thinking about historical connections, in my case, Blacks in Britain, and I think Noemi talked about this yesterday, that made that unintelligible in the narrow confines of academic knowledge. So again, let us remember that racial justice cannot be achieved by numbers or any one metric alone. As Jeff Chang says, when you choose to fight, you hope it will not only be merely for greater numbers, but rather for more power in those numbers that can lead a way to equity, unquote. So this is why Adrienne Davis and her colleagues, who just founded a center similar to the ones you'll be hearing about from the other faculty directors on this meeting, called the Center for Race, Ethnicity, and Equity. So it's E2 there at Washington University. And this is a new center founded in 2020, and there are a lot now being founded across the country. So our centers that you'll hear from today with my colleagues on the line, we met first as a collective of directors of such centers. And I think one question we have for the audience and we want to discuss is, what is really the value of these centers? Davis notes that without students, we would just be a giant think tank. And I want to just take a moment to give credit to the student activism that helped to found my center 25 years ago through a hunger strike, and that continues with the founding of so many of the work on expanding questions of race and ethnicity, whether that's from SF State 50 years ago to the present, where we continue to see new groups. I'm getting ready to close my comments, and in doing so, I just want to take a moment from a colleague we met. I think Steve was on the line, all of us at University of Washington, St. Louis with Adrienne Davis, where Chandra Ford, who is the founding director of UCLA's Center for the Study of Racism, Social Justice, and Health, made the very important point that when she established that center on Indigenous Peoples Day, she sought to integrate critical race studies lens with public health initiatives. And though I think most of us here are in the humanities, I want to point to the really breadth that critical race studies can bring to reorganizing the entire university. And to also bring up a point Chandra made, where she talks about combating liberal forms of racism, which can be overshadowed when we focus on the spectacular everyday violence that we have seen, of course, really every day, and especially over the last 4 years, if not 4 centuries, that if we can fail to interrogate the power differentials that organize the university that are seemingly benign, but I think no less pernicious in forms of racism. So we've seen a lot of university administrations give a little statement around whatever act of heinous and spectacular violence occurs, but really not necessarily look to how do we change those institutions that in which we exist, whether the police, the prison, the hospital, or the university. To be sure, it appears that universities across the country are grappling with these legacies of displacement, of enslavement and the nefarious forms of profit, which have brought them into existence. And we can think about Ruth Simmons, the first Black woman president of Brown, leading the charge to try to think about reckoning and recompense for enslavement and indigenous profits at the university. Or even at Stanford, we've just taken down the sculpture of our first president, David Starr Jordan, who was a eugenicist who took part in the Racial Betterment Society. But the renaming and the removal of such vexed figures of violence still leaves us in our centers vulnerable to displacement, troubled by remainders, and yearning for greater equity across differences. I hope that these opening remarks draw from critical race theory, interdisciplinary studies, feminist studies, Black queer studies, and the like, all my disciplinary formations, help us to sound a call to action, to mobilize compensatory redress, to respond to precarious citizens past and present, and to reckon in the bones with racial injustice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you so much. So, Stephen, you go next.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you for your leadership. I just admire everything you've done there so much in recent years. And as somebody who has been shaped in some way by the center you run, I'm just grateful for your vision that you've brought to the place in recent years. So greetings, everybody from New Haven, the historical and contemporary home of many indigenous peoples and nations, including the Mohegan, the Mashantucket Pequot, the Eastern Pequot, the Schaghticoke, the Golden Hill Paugussett, the Niantic, the Quinnipiac, and others, where we in the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration try to work mindful of their presence in its many forms, contemporary and in the past. I'm going to speak in a little bit of a different mode than Jennifer just offered, and talk a little bit about the specifics of our center as a way to get part of this conversation rolling. I direct the youngest center represented here on the panel. since we founded RITM at Yale in the winter of 2016 and have just completed our 5th anniversary. The other centers represented here are longer in the tooth, more established than that. Being established in the 2nd decade of the 20th century, as we were, gave us at Yale the opportunity to think for a while about what kind of an academic unit we actually wanted to create, that institutional contract that Rod Ferguson talked about yesterday. And we had some luxury in building on the great work already happening at places like Stanford, Chicago, and Brown, and being able to alert our administration as we made the effort to create a center that they needed to enable our work in establishing a race study center here in order to keep step with my colleagues on this panel and their places and so many other places. So as with every other comparable center I've ever heard about, Yale Center was a product of political pressure, as well as hard intellectual work and compromises with and by the administration. So here's our story. A small group of faculty members on our campus, including me, first began to meet and develop the idea of what became the RITM Center in 2007, roughly 8 years before RITM was in fact established. Those faculty were in departments like African American Studies, History, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and our Ethnicity, Race, and Migration program. No real surprise that those were represented. All of us were faculty of color, our faculty of color. All of us were cross-appointed in multiple units and had interdisciplinary interests and struggled to meet the needs and the expectations of our various units. We were frustrated by failures to successfully hire, recruit, and retain faculty members working in fields like Latinx studies, Black studies, Native and Indigenous studies, and Asian American studies. We all felt that students interested in those fields at Yale were intellectually underserved by our university in the 21st century. We all felt anger about the paucity of faculty of color on our campus generally. So in short, we were unhappy. We had watched as valued friends and colleagues were not promoted or left our campus for other seemingly more hospitable colleges and universities. And we felt tired in the 21st century, tokenized on too many committees, trotted out sometimes as showpieces when convenient, conscious that our students were not receiving the education that they wanted and needed, and trapped too often in debates with our administration that we could not escape. So that was the situation around 2007, 2008, still somewhat familiar today, I'm sure to many people in this meeting. And it was the situation that led us to ask for a research and teaching center that would both first dignify studies of race and intellectual engagements with core issues in ethnic studies and related fields as topics of studies, but also as prisms and parameters for approaching these topics. And secondly, a place that would provide resources and space and a hub, perhaps a catalyst, to advance the interests of members of our communities and serve as a magnet for attracting and retaining people interested in race studies. So the second point is important because we felt fractured and divided and isolated in separate departmental spaces on our campus. And we also knew that there were just far too few of us doing the work. We were then able to actually create the center in the 2015-2016 academic year when Yale undergraduates pushed our administration to address campus climate and faculty hiring and our undergraduate curriculum. We faculty members had this center proposal that had been sitting collecting dust in our offices from a few years before, and we were already ready to make that suggestion. So we took the center proposal to our president and our provost who approved the general plan. But I must underscore what Jennifer said, it would not have happened were it not for student struggle and student support. In my final minute or two, let me just close quickly with a few notes about our focus in the RITM Center and some of our struggles, just to put these on the table. First, you should know that we've focused to date more on graduate students than on undergraduates on our campus as a research and teaching center. While undergraduates, it seems to us, still need much that they're not getting, by comparison, graduate students have had far less structured support on our campus as emerging scholars. And because we in the center wanted to shape research, we've therefore put the emphasis in terms of our funding and our programming more on MA and PhD theses and related projects, major projects, than on the support of undergraduate classroom exercises. Second, in RITM, as at Stanford, we've tried to work across the entire university. throughout our professional schools, as well as in our faculty of arts and sciences, but also in our university museums and in our theaters and in other parts of our institution. This has been rewarding, but as you would imagine, also challenging. And that's worth talking about, the scope and scale and how to get that right. Third, we've tried in our work to amplify ongoing work at the university in various departments and units, while also developing new work that's not yet able to be amplified because it doesn't exist yet in more under-resourced areas. I'm thinking, for example, we've tried to co-sponsor events and visitors and efforts through departments that are already doing this work. But we've also tried to bring units together that don't talk to one another or haven't traditionally done that. And we've tried to focus attention and resources on topics related to race, indigeneity, and transnational migration, like Native and Indigenous studies or Latinx studies, that have had less pull in established departments. For example, there is no department there. There is a department of AFAM. So we tried to support AFAM while also putting resources in developing areas that don't have institutional support elsewhere. Fourth, we've successfully helped to bring undergraduates to Yale as undergraduate students and also doctoral students to Yale into small departments over the last 5 years. The undergraduates whom we've helped to recruit have come in part through an awards program that we've run for high school students around the country who are interested in RITM topics and doing social justice work in their communities. And we've been part of that recruitment process. The graduate students who've come to Yale at our encouragement have often come because we offer them in our center a home outside of the smaller department where they and our home is one in which they can fully engage topics related to race in ways that they may not be able to in their home department. And our center is a place where they can be assured that they will see more scholars of color than they likely will in their small humanities or social science department, where there are often far too few of them. So that's been a method of recruitment as well, or we've had some success in recruitment for that reason. Fifth, we've been more successful, I think, on reflection, I think we've been more successful at gathering graduate students across units than gathering faculty across units who don't already know one another. In fact, we've struggled with consistent faculty participation in our center, partly because faculty remain so tied to departments. Our untenured colleagues, of course, need to be present in their tenuring units. Our tenured colleagues already serve on so many committees. So our efforts, unfortunately, often just invite more work from our faculty colleagues. Yes, we'd love for you to do that conference. Just tell us what you want to do. Well, that's more work. Sure, we can help with that expense. Please fill out this form and send us your receipt and so forth. More work. Would you be willing to serve on a prize committee for the center? And so forth and so forth. Sixth, and finally, we've managed, I think, to be somewhat catalytic across campus in the spaces I've described, bringing funding and what I do think of as some kind of dignity to subversive efforts in various parts of our campus, or perhaps they're better called creative efforts or efforts at greater accuracy or something like that in different departments and programs. So while we may not always capture the attention of large numbers of faculty, we have tried to be strategic in helping faculty who want to do interesting and important things in ways that aren't being supported in their units to do that work. In fact, we've had some of our greatest success in supporting non-ladder track faculty on our campus who are working on RITM topics. We've been able to provide them some research funding that they wouldn't get otherwise. We've given them opportunities to share their research with one another, and we've organized writing groups for them that are often not available in their home departments. This may sound like small stuff, but it actually dignifies the work of people who are otherwise being treated as contingent labor all too often on our campus and elsewhere. I'd say the same with our efforts to engage with some other people on campus who may not be at the top levels of their institutional hierarchies. Some of our most creative curators, for example, or artists scattered around the university who may not have the checkbook that gives them the full funding that they want, but that we can bring some of our funding and some of our support to help them realize their vision, particularly visions related to reckoning, which after all is the topic of our conversation today. So I'm going to stop there and pass it on to my colleague. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So Riley, you come next.
Yes, thank you, Ato, and thank you to Jennifer and Stephen for their brilliant remarks. It's such a pleasure to be in conversation with my colleagues at the Centering Race Consortium, and it's my privilege to work with the incredible staff at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, Tracy Matthews, Marilyn Willis, Jacqueline Gaines, and Tiara Kilpatrick. As an opening statement, I want to provide some of the context and a sense of the day-to-day of the center's activities as a way to ground some of the intellectual, political, and ethical work as I see it. I also want to acknowledge that the University of Chicago sits on the tribal homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, as well as other tribes. And as the sixth largest urban Native community in the US, Indigenous people continue to practice their heritage traditions and care for the land and waterways. The Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, CSRPC, was established by my colleague, Michael C. Dawson, professor of political science, in 1996. And from its inception, CSRPC has been committed to establishing and sustaining a space to center and expand the study of race and ethnicity at the University of Chicago by fostering interdisciplinary, transnational, and intersectional research, teaching, and public debate. So at the center, we understand that race and ethnicity affect every idea and interaction, and we work to foster meaningful dialogues about the myriad ways race and ethnicity inform our lived experiences and scholarship. The center is committed to providing funding and other forms of support, like many of my colleagues working at other centers, for projects that are initiated by faculty affiliates, graduate students, undergraduates, artists in residence, and visiting fellows. And I'm especially proud that this year, in addition to our ongoing artists in residence program, which we've been doing in collaboration with Arts and Public Life, that we welcomed our inaugural practitioner fellows in conjunction with the Posen Center's Human Rights Lab. As part of their fellowship, each practitioner is designing a project that explores an aspect of the carceral system. By doing this kind of work, we continue to strengthen community relations with the South Side and Chicago as we continue to act in solidarity with local, national, and global struggles for racial, ethnic, economic, gender, sexual, and social justice. So in addition to providing funding and other forms of support for scholarship, overseeing an undergraduate major and minor, hosting residencies and visiting fellows, sponsoring workshops and working groups, which include the Reproduction of Race and Racial Ideology workshop, the Race Working Group, which is a graduate-led and graduate-only space, the Mass Incarceration Working Group, and the Race and Pedagogy Working Group, and the Slavery and Visual Culture Working Group. The center supports and sponsors a number of public programs geared toward promoting an investigation of the ties between race, ethnicity, and culture, often in collaboration with student groups, other campus centers, and academic units, as well as community-based institutions. This is the day-to-day work of the center, and yet we are also ethically and morally compelled to be responsive to our current environments, to provide forums for activists and scholars, to give context and share strategies for combating racist, sexist, homophobic, and transphobic injustice and violence. Unlike some of the other schools in the Centering Race Consortium, the University of Chicago does not have a department devoted to the study of race and ethnicity. However, through the committed work of some of CSRPC's faculty affiliates, working within the More Than Diversity campaign, and in solidarity with years of organizing from UChicago students, with UChicago United, and particularly Ethnic Studies Now, the Grad Student Union, and the Black Grad Student Collective, there has been some progress made on that front, which allows for us at the center to begin to engage in the related process of imagining a renewed center that works alongside an emergent department. And I'd like to pause here, but we'll be happy to return to some of these issues later, as I think this moment at the University of Chicago allows us to think about reckoning on a number of registers, and perhaps also to consider what comes after a reckoning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Riley. So, Tricia, you're next.
Thank you, Ato. Thank you, my dear colleagues, members of the CRC. It's been great working with you and fantastic hearing you here and planning this event. Thanks for everyone who's come out on this, at least in my part of the country, rainy day. I'm going to try to focus my comments on a broader set of questions and problems that don't entirely always dovetail with my own center, but when they do, I'll certainly emphasize it. And that has to do with what I would call the sort of consequences of the legacy of the formation of race centers. And, you know, all of the centers represented here have tremendous faculty support, and amazing work comes out of these places, you know, graduate student investment, so on and so forth. So I'm not in any way disparaging that level of intellectual investment, but what concerns me is the degree to which that work is undermined by the very structures that force us into the placement that we're in. So I want to talk a bit about that first. The formation of the centers that study race and ethnicity broadly in the United States almost always emerge from student protest first and foremost. And everyone here mentioned that at one form or another, either in the past or in the present. It's like, it's an ongoing project. But I want to say a little bit more about what that student activism is about, because it often becomes a touchstone, but it's a very important part of the critique of disciplinary knowledge in the university. Students eventually, students of color of various types come to the university only in the last 50 years. And they realize that the structures of knowledge, in fact, are not in any way designed to shed light on the histories of the groups out of which they come. And that kind of protest is usually focused specifically on demanding that the curriculum provide significant educational sources for them. And in addition, it's a challenge to the role of universities. The social protest is a challenge to the role of universities in the given town and a given city, and its role in being a sort of not in alignment with social justice movements in the street and in the public sphere. And so it's an implicit critique about the role of race in the disciplines. And that's why this notion of institutionalizing critical race studies is such an important part of the framing. It's not simply to study race, because that was actually going on every once in a while, but in ways that was actually reproducing the very problems that we're talking about. Jennifer talked a bit about this at the outset, in terms of anthropology and so on, and objects. I just want to really put the work that we're doing in the context of disciplines that are sort of structurally hostile, even in the cases when you have, you know, well-meaning faculty members in those departments. I'm not making an argument against every academic in a discipline in the United States, but I'm more saying that I think it's really important to talk about the institutional tension that's there. The space of centers on race, it seems to me, are really developed in the interstices of the university as a whole. That there's a very little space that is cracked open, and we endeavor to inhabit it, to give it life, to figure out what's needed in our particular local circumstances. But that process results in a number of things that I think are exceptionally important. One is that it's built-in fragility, and that fragility is registered in lots of different ways. It's registered in terms of funding and support, space, whether or not centers or interdisciplinary spaces can be homes for tenure track positions in all or in part. It's about whether or not it can be seen as a valuable and important part of the university and its forms of knowledge production. And that matters a lot for whether or not faculty from other departments can be involved safely and professionally. It's understaffed. And then it's often, frankly, you know, trotted out, and this is over and over again across 50 years, trotted out at you know, the crisis of the decade or the crisis of the year to sort of hold and be the center of discussion. Now, you know, I will admit at Brown, I've had tremendous support for the center during my tenure, but CSREA has been around since the mid-1980s, 1986, and for a lot of that time had extremely limited support and was in many ways starved of the necessary resources to do a number of the things it wanted to do. It, however, was a very successful incubator for the ethnic studies concentration at Brown. And so that's been a very important advance that happened before. But, you know, the level of work that it takes to keep this, you know, crack open for all of us is very significant. And it not only requires the immense work of, you know, our colleagues who donate their time, as Steve was pointing out, to various endeavors, but it means that those of us who direct them aren't simply directing, you know, in a climate of sort of, you know, presumed value and dignity and significance. One has to perpetually explain the value and significance and why. Even in cases when Centers for Race are placed in campaigns for endowments, which is extremely rare. But even in the cases when that happens, one has to explain over and over again what one does and why it's a central relevant issue. And why would any white people want to give money to this, for example, which if I could tell you how many times I've had that conversation. So for me, this means that the reckoning is not so much about more centers and more sort of the repetition of the structures that we're in. It's really about a fundamental challenge to the construction of race and the marginality of race, to the thinking and the framing of the vast majority of traditional disciplinary knowledges. And that can't just be adding on a section in the curriculum or adding on one course. It has to be a very significant reframing of what these disciplines are about, perhaps a dismantling, which is what my colleague Matt Guttural was talking about yesterday. But I think this reckoning can't just be sort of hoping students are going to protest enough to expand more attention, or that that we'll be able to, you know, have a friendly administration, right? Which, you know, would be lovely, and in my case is. But what I think the reckoning really has to be about is a real fundamental infrastructural intellectual challenge to the whole enterprise, to say that if you think you can do discipline X and not fundamentally think about race, gender, and sexuality, indigeneity, and so on as significant parts of how your discipline was either shaped or how it's functioning now, then you're not doing the work you need to do. It has to be that level of racial reckoning, in my opinion. Otherwise, we will be in very much this same position 25 years from now, with a next generation of brilliant people who will replace my brilliant colleagues here, and for sure me, and they will say very much the same thing, maybe with different academic language, but they'll be in a very similar position. And that ultimately is a stabilizing phenomenon, right? So that our fragility, our underfunding, and yet our constant repetition of protest and inclusion and so on. And so it's a dance of repetition that I think doesn't change the outcomes in significant ways. And so I just want to end with you know, a real challenge that we don't necessarily want to blow up our centers, right? But there's a sense in which our demise has to be part of our plan, in that we have to imagine that departments can be so fundamentally changed that we would be part of that change, rather than keeping this tension between margin and center in terms of the disciplines. So I'm going to stop there, because I know we're been talking a while, but I'm looking forward to our conversation as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tricia, and to all the panelists. This has been magnificent. Now, I have a set of questions to ask to open up debates, and I have the questions here, but I'm going to pose one of my own that I fabricated as I was listening to you guys. And it has to do with, to put it very simply, the problem of proposition making in interdisciplinary studies, because all these centers are at heart interdisciplinary. Now, what do I mean by the problem of proposition making? I'm in an English department. Now, in an English department, and I'm sure that Riley will see echoes of his own department, English at Chicago, in what I'm going to say. Shakespearean, and what I'm going to say now aligns specifically with Shakespeare and medieval studies. A Shakespearean, to make a proposition on Shakespeare, for it to be salient in the field of Shakespeare studies, will have to master several languages, Latin and Greek were among them. We'll also have to master different discourses, medical history, sometimes even music and so on. But one of the signature features of Shakespeareans is that they're etymologists. They like diving into the meaning of words in Shakespeare. There's no serious Shakespearean who doesn't know something about etymology for a very simple and practical reason. The language of Shakespeare is over 450 years old. Now, if you shift from the medieval, and the medievalists are also similar, if you shift from medieval studies and Shakespeare studies to, say, post-colonialism, my own area, our protocols of proposition making are different. They are more advocacy oriented. They are more, shining a torchlight on inequality and colonialism and so on and so forth. Our protocols of proposition making are so different that it is not unusual in English departments for Shakespeareans and medievalists to think that they're in completely different departments and concerns from, say, Shakespeareans. My question is then this. So this is back to what Tricia said about we should contemplate the demise of or the non-existence of our various centers of ethnic studies. What would it take for the protocols of proposition making in anthropology, in sociology, in English, in the various disciplines to admit race as an aspect of proposition making? And this is not simply about looking at race, because you could look at race and still not change the way that you make your propositions. So this is a question about intellectual paradigms. It's not merely additive. It's not merely, let us talk about race now, but it's about so for example, as a post-colonial, I talk about race completely differently from how a Shakespearean or even a classicist talks about race, because it's completely different, because the genealogies of the idea of race in the classics are different. What would you, so this is my invitation for you to give to lend your thoughts to the problematic of proposition making in our interdisciplinary race and equity, CCSRE, and so on, but in relation to how our protocols of proposition making might make sense within the individual disciplines. So this is my question to start with. We can start from the same order of speaking. So Jennifer can respond.
Just briefly, and I do think it's a related question. My father was a social scientist, and he used to say that my questions began where his ended in terms of being a quantitative person. And my greatest, I think, discussion that we would have precisely this question was when he was writing a long chapter on Galton's theory of G in psychology, and had the good fortune to put in at least. And of course, this was taken up, and this was a racist idea. Galton was a eugenicist, right? And he said that had he not been in discussions with me over time, that would have been a quote unquote irrelevant detail to explaining, how that term worked. And similarly, even with Shakespeare studies, I know you know the work of Kim Hall, and we were talking about this yesterday. Even in terms of etymology, Peter Stolley-Ross was actually my dissertation advisor, who was a Shakespearean, very much interested in etymology. But where that takes you is not just a classical myth, but to very key terms, such as what is a blackamoor. And so we are always, I think, already engaged, even the very notion of an English department, right? With, England and the English language, right? If you really get into it in medieval studies, this came up yesterday, Geraldine Hang's work, that really opens up again to a global world in which race is produced discursively. And I think it was Noemi yesterday was talking about the fact that, who is asking the question can sometimes change the very notion of what is important to know, which is kind of what I was trying to say. And I think that it speaks also very much to everything everyone has said here. And Tricia saying, that what would happen, right, if we completely changed what we think a university is for, whom does it serve, what is this about, why are we engaged in this kind of work? And we've seen this with the increase of the global university. And I think that that's why that term reckoning, which is also talking about the distribution of funds and sources and value, is so important.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Jennifer. Stephen?
Yeah, this is a great question. Thank you. There's so much to say on this. I think I'll just try to, keep it relatively simple and say that, I think it is, to me, I always come back to words like, dignity and value, which Jennifer and, Tricia, and I think Riley and everybody uses very commonly. I think to me, it's about enfranchising points of view, dignifying those points of view, allowing formations and understandings to take center stage in university-wide and societal conversations that actually minoritize or diminish the prominence of kind of narrow, historically rooted, but narrow kind of ways of thinking about problems that are very much departmentalized. I'm fortunate at Yale that I actually work in a university that we certainly have a lot of problems around interdisciplinarity and recognizing interdisciplinarity, but we have some very wonderful interdisciplinary programs, and they have prominence. And I often say that, I'm a historian, and one of my appointments is in history, but I often say that many of our best historians on our campus are not in the history department. And I'd like to see our students in history actually work with them as well, even as they're getting their degree and their credential in the department to which they were admitted. I'm thinking mostly of graduate students here. So I think that centers can, I think that centers can work in a lot of different ways. I think I'm all for the revolution and hopefully working for it. And I think that the idea of the withering away of departments, is absolutely something to be anticipated and pushed toward. I also think that we make small gains in departments by dignifying people's work who actually very much identify with their discipline and want to see their future in a discipline in ways that I may not, I may not be the thing I think of as most productive. And yet, we're talking about the kind of politics of small numbers, right? There's relatively few of us. And so I want to see our center, for example, working with and helping move forward conversations that may be very disciplinarily bound and that I think may not be the long-term ways in which we want to go, but that actually I think do bring value, because I want that particular faculty member to prosper in their local department. And I know that if they're prospering, they're bringing a couple of students along with them. So I think we can do that work, which may be additive and not, revolutionary, alongside doing the revolutionary work, which is more about privileging other ways of knowing, other methodologies, other connections that, are different problems of proposition, as you were putting them. And I think it's the challenge is to be open to doing all of those kinds of work at once. And so anyway, that's where we are, I think, on our campus. And it leaves us sometimes unclear about next steps and priorities, because there is so much work to do. But we don't want to foreclose what may seem like the more cautious or more conservative approach, because it's not radical or revolutionary enough. We want to think about ways to do all of that.
Thank you, Stephen. Actually, there's a line that you used, which I was used to think a little bit more, is enfranchising different points of view. You said this in your response. Enfranchising different points of view. A whole lot of weight can be put to bear on the question of how to enfranchise different points of view as an aspect of proposition making in the discipline. Because it's true, in English literary studies, they have historically not been very open to enfranchising minority points of view, of which there are many even in the dominant text. So the question of how to enfranchise different points of view is really important. Riley, please.
No, thanks. And I was also really struck by that formulation. In some ways, it also kind of underscores how I think about what it means to do work at the center, which is that we are a space for maximalist approaches to race and ethnicity, that there are many ways through many modes that people are engaging in these questions critically. To that, and in concert, I hope, with the comments that Jennifer and that Steve have already made. I'll just add that, some part of your question is also making me think a little bit about some of the fields that I work in, for which the kind of matter of institutionalization is not settled. To be working in the field of trans studies, it is not really seen as having a particular way in which a proposition might be made. And so I'm also deeply interested in, or have been hearing echoed throughout the course of the last 2 days, the kind of provocation from Stuart Hall about what it is that for him, what cultural studies would do, for example, to a discipline like sociology, which is in some ways it was to kind of cannibalize it, but in so doing to make it anew. And I think often, sitting and being trained in interdisciplines, the work then becomes it's obviously always still rife with power, but it's also about a kind of project about legibility in audiences. I think, as Jennifer mentioned as well, who are you talking to, as a kind of another note to Noemi. But I really appreciate the question as an invitation to kind of think along these ideas.
Thanks, Riley. Tricia.
I guess I just have two additions to these wonderful remarks. The first is that, disciplinary boundaries are somewhat arbitrary. They have historical formations, but sometimes you have different propositional formations in the same discipline, and they're not necessarily limited because of it. What that means is that disciplines are, political skirmishes, right? Really, they're the result of winning political skirmishes. And as such, they shouldn't be treated as gospel, and they should be understood as being in, transformational formation of one form or another. So when you say, can the protocols of proposition making that might come out of a critical race studies framework, where can it be? Well, it can be in a lot of places for the reasons I said, right? The second thing is that, I totally want to support Steve's initial point, which was, look, you do both and. You do all you have to do at this moment. And, we've been very fortunate to recruit some amazing scholars on race to Brown in the last 5 to 8 years, who increased the ranks of what was already a really amazing group of people. So, I wouldn't say, well, we just got to burn it down. We don't do any hiring. Don't put anybody in a discipline. I'm certainly not saying that. But I just want to illuminate that when we accept the categories, when we accept the disciplinary structures, and we allow the power that they hold over resources, right? There's no question. I don't think anybody on our panel would say like a history department is in any jeopardy of disappearing anytime soon, right? Like, not to pick on, historians, but I could say a number of disciplines. And that fact is a really important part of the problem and the circumstance that we're in. So what I'm really asking us to do is be not so much radical only in action, but in thinking about knowledge production so that we don't end up here again. And by here, I mean that, amazing work is being done, but as a number of people mentioned, there's fragility around getting tenure. There's fragility about what kind of work matters. There's fragility around what kinds of arguments you can make about race and expect to have the same type of career. And all of those things are part of the issue that brought our centers into existence in the first place. So I just, you can't have it both ways. We can't have it both ways, it seems to me. And I just want to remind us of that as we think of how we want our centers to function going forward.
Wonderful, Tricia. I like your line. Disciplines are products of political skirmishes. That's a good line. You know, there's always
later. You can have it.
there's always a food fight happening. No, I like this. These are all wonderful comments. Now I'm going to go to the prompt questions that I have here, and the one that fascinates me most is actually I'm doctoring one of them, which is what has been the success, or how do you think you might operationalize placing race and equity studies on the entire undergraduate curriculum? So everybody is interested, has to do something about it. Do you think this is just a utopia? Or at Princeton some years ago, they nominated Anthony Appier's book on cosmopolitanism, that everyone entering Princeton that year had to read it. You know, now Appier's a theory of cosmopolitanism is what one might describe as a gentleman's theory of cosmopolitanism. It is not anything that would, I think, it doesn't poke anyone in the eye. He himself is such a gentleman. So, but that's what the students read. And so they were all came out feeling completely cosmopolitan, but not in ways that would unsettle the very principle of cosmopolitanism as such. So my question is, how might we, persuade our universities to make race and equity a general concern across the campus? So that's my question. So starting with Jennifer again.
Okay, and I hope we'll get to lots of questions too, if there's some from the audience. I guess I would just say that, again, what does it mean to read? Because there are, I think, 4 books for the Stanford students this year. One of them, I think, Call Me By My Name, right? And they have over the years had, Neil deGrasse Tyson's work and so forth. But how are those texts being read and interpreted, rejected, or valued, right? This is then at the heart of how also I think we need to transform not just what we teach, right? To go back to your example earlier of sort of Shakespeare, right? You can open that up to questions of race and equity. But it's also how you teach it, and and what that syllabi is, what's the method, and what ultimately are you trying to change? And is it then also not just about how we read or what we read, but in what context? And again, I'll just say, for whose benefit, because I think too often even the way those books are selected have to do with still the larger problem that we have inherited of the university as a space a la Oxbridge of educating a liberal citizenry always already self-segregated previously, before we had EEOC or ways of diversifying, when schools had their quota of Jewish professors, or Blacks like Du Bois were not allowed to teach at University of Pennsylvania. Yeah, that the very idea of the university student, right, is one that I believe is still imagined to be ideally a certain type of person. And so that whole idea of what is the liberal education for? I mean, I don't want to go too meta with that, but I think it's relevant, right? Again, whom do we imagine we are serving, and how those books would even be interpreted?
And then also the relationship between university and community, because often universities are like they are elite pods, the elite pods of innovation. And some university departments have no interest in what is happening in the outside world. So also the relationship between what we do and the communities beyond.
That's why CSRE has a lovely tradition of community engaged learning. And we have students do an internship, but of a particular kind where they're prepared to think about questions of community-based research and solidarity before they even go out into the quote unquote community spaces.
All right. So Stephen, do you have something?
Yeah, sure. I can answer this question quickly, I think. How could we have these conversations carefully? I mean, I think that that's really an important principle. Expertly, I think is another one. They can't be had on college and university campuses and kind of rambly and ways without careful thought, and also in ways that are, and this is really important, I think, cognizant of the differential ways in which people enter and experience these conversations, right? I mean, for so many of our students, college is so different for most of them from what they grew up with. And those who we would want to be very cognizant of supporting in these conversations can oftentimes take these conversations as very difficult and very hard. And the lack of support in these conversations for people who experience these issues directly and disproportionately can be very challenging. So those would be at least, just so, without trying to get too much into the details, those would be at least 3 principles that I would want to suggest ought to be guiding any discussion of this sort.
Wonderful. Riley?
Thanks. And, I am really just struck by, I think, what are some of the great principles that have been put on the table. And I'll add, I think, just one more thing, which is really that, and a kind of conversation, intellectual conversations about race are happening in places in which they are also being actively disavowed. And so it's also about, providing a kind of way of seeing that what we are doing is engaging in racialized forms of thought that may be absented of what we see as a kind of legible understanding of a racialized body or how race plays out in terms of discourses of race relation.
All right, Tricia,
yes.
and then we'll open it up to
for sure. Super quick. I think the way I would encourage us to do, a critical race studies intervention in the curriculum is to remind our students and the disciplines to remind themselves that they were formed under a white supremacist, colonialist infrastructure and ideological framework. All of them. And that's not a sort of sub piece of the puzzle off on the side. It was a fundamental component, not the only one, not even necessarily the most important one, although I think it ranks up there. And that as a mode of self-interrogation, right? You have to be willing to interrogate the self. That's a Western, philosophical framework from Socrates in the first place, right? You must interrogate the self in order to grow, to learn, to transform. So it wouldn't just be about adding courses or readings, it's about asking the disciplines to do the true self-interrogation that's necessary to understand why race is a central element in the formation of everything, and the ways in which these ideas that were not about race on their explicit terms were all about race and control and space and who was a problem and who needed to be excluded from governance and who didn't, what mattered in the Constitution and what didn't, so on and so forth. So the principles were great. We just added Black people. We messed up the first time. We added them later. No, that's not what happened. So that's what I think is more important than anything in terms of, really to making the kind of change you're talking about.
Wonderful, Tricia. Wonderful, you all. So now the questions. Are we going to, Megan, are you going to read them out for us, or shall I?
I can do that.
You can do it. All right, please.
Thank you. So let me pose this question to all of us. We have a question from an instructor, I think, who is asking a general question about requirements in their fields. And the specifics are about language requirements that are required for the achievement of a degree that strike this person as perhaps outdated and potentially a kind of mechanism for predetermining the direction of the discipline, I think. So maybe what the question is on the table is how should people be thinking about these things that may be ostensibly race neutral in a particular discipline or department that actually do have the effects of perpetuating ways of approaching topics that either mischaracterize or fail even to recognize the kind of topics we're talking about. So I just asked the question, so I'm not going to answer it. I guess I'll turn it to any one of you who wants to take that on.
Well, I guess maybe I'll just say super quickly that when I was in graduate school, one of my colleagues petitioned to have Jamaican Creole, which she was studying Caribbean Lit, count for her quote unquote foreign language. She herself was actually West Indian. And so these questions of, again, the scholarly languages, I'm not saying don't know them, right? But they have that tradition that Tricia just laid out for us so nicely. Again, of what are the languages to know, and those two, came to us out of a particular hierarchy of where we thought scholarly thought, and in what language scholarly thought happens.
Yeah, I think thank you. I think the matter of language acquisition, and Jennifer, your comments really got me here, is that really it's supposed to signify one of the tools that's needed to get at the thing that you want to get at inside of your particular training. And so, I also was trained in media studies, a fairly new kind of 20th century invention of a discipline, wherein things like knowing code was a way to, to suffice in your language requirement. And so I think these kinds of questions, as you put it, that are seemingly race neutral, but also get at a kind of larger philosophical orientation of what it means to be graduate curriculum, in which the case has to be made, why X, in the service of what you are aiming to do, both in terms of your question, but also in terms of the container of the program that you happen to be sitting in while you do your work now.
Ato, do you want to take a shot at this? I mean, you may.
I don't have anything to add.
No, Steve, you go ahead too. I don't have
Please go ahead with the questions.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if this also relates to another question that was asked, which is essentially what students might be doing if they're working in a field, in a department, in a so-called discipline in which the issues that we've been talking about, centering race, haven't really made it to their fore. Any thoughts for any students in the audience who may be struggling with these, very specific questions in their own departmental home, whether those are undergraduates or graduate students?
I actually can I jump in?
Yeah.
At Toronto, I run the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies, new. So we set it up. It's now like 15 years old. And so I was at the University of Toronto before I moved, jumped around and got to Stanford. And this question came up all the time. Why diaspora studies? And one of the things I pointed out to my students is that every respectable institution these days has a diversity. They'll call it different things. They have a diversity office, and they're interested in diversity. So that, for example, many banks have found out that as new immigrants arrive and settle, new immigrants are very interested in putting down roots by buying homes. So every bank has a diversity officer whose interest is in targeting marketing products to newly arrived immigrants. And some banks are more successful than that. But as someone who has done critical race studies can not only shape the direction of these products, but also give the bank a higher, as it were, consciousness on these things. Let me jump to another completely ridiculous example. FIFA, the Football Federation, is very much about, they say so themselves, so we can take them on their word, equity, the distribution of resources to various leagues, to historically marginalized populations and so on. What better than someone who has done critical race studies to go and work at FIFA and tell them that you're looking at the thing completely wrong. and from my training. In other words, there are many, and the more we produce students who are savvy and understanding of critical race studies, and the more impact that they make in different industries and so on, the more value will be given to our fields. So this is one answer that I used to give to my students in diaspora and transnational studies. Say they need you. Just tell them you are here and they will hire you.
Yeah, I'm wondering if I could jump in for a second, Ato, and just ask some of my colleagues here a couple of questions about what they imagine would be some important new areas to move in terms of their centers or things they have on tap for the people who joined us today to say, what are we going to do with the space that we have? Maybe it's programming for next year, maybe it's envisioning something 5 years down the road, maybe it's challenges, maybe, whatever it is. But I think sort of what are we going to do that we're either excited about, that we think is going to change the sort of landscape of where we are, or what kinds of things do you wish you could do and you just can't see your way right now? But I think it's important to kind of, imagine a future together. And anyone, Jennifer, Riley, Stephen?
I can jump in. I have, this is an opportunity to say how excited I am to be working with the colleagues here on this Centering Race Consortium that was funded by the Mellon Foundation. So one thing I would say very positively that I think we're really excited about doing is looking for ways to partner with other colleges and universities to expand the sense of community, the good ideas, the opportunities to think together about issues that are just so critical, that we all agree are critical. There's just not enough of us to go around on any given campus, and we need one another's support and good ideas. We need to be able to create opportunities for one another. We need critical feedback from one another that we may not get on our home campuses. So, the chance to work with the colleagues on this call and with others around, on these campuses is really exciting to me. And we're hoping to be able to do this, with faculty involved, with students involved, with artist residents involved. And so I'm really excited about that. One thing that I'm concerned about, and I don't know if any of the rest of you struggle with this, is that our center has gotten pulled in on our campus to institutional efforts related to diversity, equity, and belonging, right? The DEIB efforts. And in some ways we want to be there, because I do think that the kind of intellectual work that we do, the kind of the credentialing and amplifying of work in these areas as critical areas of research and teaching does translate to questions of climate. There's a relationship between ennobling these fields and who gets hired and who stays on a given campus. So there's reasons why we want to be involved in this work. At the same time, there are sets of challenges, I think, here when academics like me, and I think like all of us, get pulled into these conversations, into committees about tone setting on campus, best practices on campus, that are, not related to the kind of research and teaching and other things that I think we're primarily focused on. So I'm just flagging that as an area of challenge for us. And I didn't know if anybody else had any thoughts about that. So I've given you the positive, which is the consortium, that's one thing. And then I'm kind of raising the question of how, if and how our centers have a role to play in these broader university efforts. I don't want to be an HR specialist, for example, right? And I feel sometimes like I do get pulled into that stuff, and our center does. And if we get pulled into that, we're not doing other important work that we could be doing. So if that's of interest, maybe somebody wants to comment on that.
Jennifer or Riley, anybody?
Well, the thing is that one of the reasons why Stanford, I'll have to talk about Stanford, Jennifer, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm new, I'm only two years at Stanford. Why the recruitment and retention of faculty of color has been a problem is specifically because, not just because of the tone, Stephen, what you just mentioned, the tone, but also because for some reason the numbers they never are able to grow because people come and then they leave. So our being pulled into these things, distracting though they might seem, sometimes almost inescapable, because we want to increase the density of faculty of color. But to increase the density and the numbers, we have to somehow contribute to creating the environment where the faculty of color arriving sees themselves in it. This is especially crucial for pre-tenure faculty. So senior faculty like me, I'm at home everywhere. It doesn't really matter. But for junior, I can imagine if I had arrived as a pre-tenure, I would have been scared for the rest of my 7 years, before I got tenure at Stanford, because they don't, the history of the tenuring of a faculty of color, let's say in the English department, let's put it very diplomatically, it's suboptimal. And this is putting it diplomatically. So in a way, you almost cannot escape it.
I think you've put it in managerial terms, and that was my gesture towards the global university. But like University of Chicago, we at Stanford suffer from not having a department, for example, of African and African American studies. Before I too was hired as a full professor over 10 years ago at Stanford, I was a full professor in African and African American studies 100%. So the kinds of reach and interdisciplinarity and centering race that we've talked about was very much a given and understood and valued. And we are like University of Chicago fighting, and as you well know, Ato, because you've been a wonderful part of that, not only to have a department and maybe a department of ethnic studies, I don't know what the landscape will look like, but also an institute, because it's at Stanford that institutes have great value, and literally in terms of resources and scope. And hiring more people, so it's not the same few. The numbers of Black faculty at Stanford have remained statistically flat since the 1980s. And I think that is in part because we've invested, in fact, too much in junior people, which is continuing to happen, who are brilliant and wonderful, but don't necessarily have the wherewithal to compartmentalize and know a landscape or understand even necessarily what a university is about. That's a huge transition. And we're not taught in graduate school to do this kind of DEI or DEB work. And so it's, again, the burdens of representation that fall too often on the bodies that always already are laboring at a certain kind of personal expense. So we need to do more of that structural change that everyone on the call was talking about, to really make it better labor conditions and really change the face of the university.
If I could jump in, Riley, unless you were about to jump in.
Well, go ahead, Tricia.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to piggyback for a second, because my favorite thing about Zoom is that you can quickly surf the internet before you say something. So I want to say that Stanford's Black faculty are 2% of the faculty. So let's just think about the numbers we're talking about. So when we're saying, well, they leave, it doesn't actually matter. You can't fix the climate with 2%. So
and for Black women, it's 1%.
Oh, great. It's 1%. Well, the internet needs to go catch up. That's why I acknowledged I went to the Stanford website, so that in case it was incorrect, I wasn't going to be held responsible. But that's an unbelievable failure, right, in numbers, right? It's easy for me to say that because I'm not at Stanford. But this is extremely important. Of course there's going to be climate issues. I'm sure when they're calling Steve in to say, can you discuss it? It's all about, we can't afford to lose any more, or whatever the problem may be. But, this is a real problem. I mean, we just can't stand around and act like we're all doing all this. And everyone Black isn't doing race work either necessarily. So when you bring those numbers down, you have to bring them down even further. And I just want to comment on Steve's really important point about diversity work. That climate stuff is the university's job, and there are lots of talented people who do this for a living, and they need to be invested in, and all the faculty and staff need to be participating in what to do with that. Certainly there's some intellectual work that overlaps and dovetails with that, and I get called to do the same thing you're talking about. some of my own research on systemic racism overlaps, so I can just stay to my research and it still has a kind of DAP effect. But, you know, if that's not what you're doing, you shouldn't be called in there. But just one last thing on the positive, because I love Steve's positive, negative. I have to end with the positive because my negatives outweigh the positives all the time. My positive is not only that this has been super exciting for the 4 schools to think this way, but that we've really been empowered to create, you know, cross-university curricula and cross-university teaching. And I think we should, I'm empowered, I'm inspired, and our grant empowers us to really do that. And I think that's super important because not only will that help our various 1% to 2% be in community, but it will also just create a kind of collective knowledge and expand all of our work much more quickly. So this is, you know, Zoom, the sort of crisis of the pandemic, creating a virtual world as the norm, and the context of the grant and the geniuses who were speaking yesterday, and those of you who are in the audience here, you know, this is a really exciting moment where we can take this work, make it public, make it shared, and push forward.
Let me say something else that's exciting. You know, I kind of made this reference earlier to the kind of politics of small numbers. You know, this is the flip side of, you know, that 1% that we're talking about at Stanford. Or I often say, like, I'm one of 3 Mexican-American faculty members I know at Yale, and I'm married to the number 2, you know, and so there's only one who I'm not married to on our campus. So anyway, so small numbers, right? But the flip side of that is what we do know is that in working with students, with colleagues, if we can make differences in their lives, right? If we can help to bring that one extra person to our campus, or help them to get that seminar paper done, or get that master's thesis or that doctoral dissertation done, or keep that colleague who was hired on our campus, but, you know, is considering a move. If we can make a positive addition to any of those moments in those people's lives, these can have remarkable effects on our fields, on the departments or the units in which they're working, on the students that they're working alongside with, whether we're talking about a student or we're talking about, a faculty member. We work with far more than small numbers in our centers. That's certainly true. But when we succeed individual by individual by individual, I think, we can have, kind of really important multiplying effects that ought to be recognized. And so that's one of the things that makes me happy, because when it's in this work, there are moments where you feel set back by the larger atmosphere in which we're working. I could have told stories, about that, as I know everybody on this call could have. And yet at the same time, we are able to hold on to, I think, these experiences with small groups of people, or even with individuals that we know really do have made a difference. And just looking at at you, Jennifer, Riley, and Tricia, knowing some of the faculty you've supported, the students you've supported, it's amazing to see the work that you've done with those people over time, and the way in which your investment of time, your trust in their projects, the leadership you've given, really has, made a really important difference to people on your campuses, but also well off your campuses.
I just saw a question here, Riley. Sorry to interrupt, but it's an important one. I think it's from one of the participants. Is the consortium open to HBCU collaborations? And this is a question for you guys.
That is the hope. We were charged by Mellon with these 4 institutions, but I think our goal is to work not only with HBCUs and Indigenous colleges, community colleges, which there's a push to make those free now, which would be wonderful, but other kinds of institutions. I think Steve mentioned museums, places of where folks are incarcerated and education is happening. So I think that there is, and that's a lead-in for tonight's wonderful connected event to Reginald Dwayne Betts and his interview with E-Viewing tonight. But that we really hope this is the seed that's going to grow and connect. And we absolutely welcome partnerships, and we'll be actively seeking them out. I was going to say that earlier when Steve was saying, what are you looking forward to? And I'm saying, looking forward to working with even more folks.
So Riley, I sorry to have interrupted you. I thought that was an important question to bring up. So I interrupted you, Riley. Please,
Yeah,
please.
no, I mean, I think Jennifer really answered that and also gave me another occasion to say that I hope that you will join us for the CSRPC's annual public lecture, which is also the closing plenary for this Racial Reckonings and the Future of the Humanities conference in just about an hour from now. So I hope that many of you will be able to come back for that. But I also was really just sitting with, Steve's, and I think this is perhaps also inclusive of what does it mean to think about opening the consortium or collaborating across a whole host of different institutional sites, which is that, I was really like, yeah, often when we talk about kind of grief, tragedy, deficit, we think about it as cumulative and compounding. But we also might want to attend to the ways that there are other kinds of collective energy that can have a kind of cumulative effect. And so I really heard that inside of what I think is the real aim of the work that we've been doing at the Centering Race Consortium and the real desire for it as it grows over the course of the next several years and hopefully beyond.
Well, last remarks. I think we have some 2 minutes to go. So final remarks, 30 seconds each, starting with Tricia.
Okay, couple of quick points. Ideas really matter, and this work, no matter how marginal it may appear, can have an outsized effect. I have a tremendous sense of hope when I look at my students and my colleagues and all there is. And I just want to push us forward and see as many obstacles as we need to see to make as much space as possible. And we hope that we'll work with many of you in this in the audience today to make that happen in the future.
Jennifer?
I put it in the chat already, but I do believe that there is joy and strength in this kind of collective work, and to know that you're not the only one anywhere laboring singularly, but rather we're all looking to do this work, and all of it really does make a difference and matter. So I'm grateful. Thank you.
Riley?
Yeah, no, before joining or getting into graduate school, I was an organizer, and there's so much of what it means to direct the center where I feel like I'm drawing on every available toolkit here, precisely because there are so many people who rightfully have a stake in the center's business and activity. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to work with those folks, as well as to work a collaborative across these universities. There is a lot of work to be done. And I think the centers and the CRC has been a great site from which to think about doing the good work that's available.
And Stephen, finally.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody. I mean, if the struggle is long, right? We all are running centers aware that, we inherit struggle that's decades old on our campuses and beyond our campuses and in the broader educational system. And I think we're at an important moment as we work together and collaborate, hopefully, with people who are witnessing and in the audience today to sort of think about changing higher education at this moment. I mean, there's a lot of work to do to catch up to the realities of the world, to serve the people that we want to serve, and to be agents of change in the ways that our centers, but more broadly our campuses, ought to be agents of change. So thank you all.
So thank you all. This has been magnificent. I've learned a lot. Thank you very much. Thank you.